Hi, Matthew Holt with the TCB Spotlight, and I am checking on a company I haven't talked to for a while, although I was there or thereabouts kind of early in the start. The company is called Medable, and I'm talking here not with the CEO, a certain Dr. Michelle Longmire. I'm talking with the Chief Scientific Officer. This is Pam Tenaerts. Pam, welcome to TCB. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. I'm really excited about talking to you about the worlds of decentralized clinical trials.
Well, so let's start there, because most people have no clue what a clinical trial is. They have some vague idea that people are put into a trial and some result comes out, the drug gets approved or the vaccine gets approved or not. But most of the people don't know there's a sort of hierarchy of companies, right? There's the life science company, which creates the drug or the pill or the product. There's a bunch of doctors' offices and centers and academic medical researchers who have patients and are doing the study. And there's a group of companies in the middle called clinical research organizations, CROs. And there's probably a bunch of others floating around the space. But can you quickly sort of outline the map of the kinds of actors involved in clinical trials? And then we'll dig into what Medable does.
Yeah, great. That's a really good question. That's usually where I like to start, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So you start off with a medical product. And that could be a drug made by a pharma company, a biologic. It could be a medical device, like a hip, an implant of a hip, or a syringe. And then what happens is, before those type of products get to come on the market and are approved for use by humans in the US or elsewhere in the world, they need to go through a set of tests to ensure that they are safe to be administered and that they are effective, that they actually do what people think they're going to be doing. And so that process is called a clinical trial. So many of the pharma companies, medical device companies, have departments, R&D departments, that develop these drugs and then create protocols, which are basically the recipes for a clinical trial. It tells you what people should be part of the clinical trial, what tests and procedures ought to happen over a certain amount of time, and what the improvement is that they're seeking. They're trying to prove that they can have an improvement. And they're also counting side effects to show anything that shows up on the patient information leaflet is things that were found during a clinical trial. And then what they found over time is clinical trials ebb and flow. Sometimes you have many, sometimes you don't. So there's this other group of people called CROs, clinical research organizations, that have come in to sort of help out these companies that are creating products to conduct the clinical trials and help them get organized and done. The actual people running the trials and finding the patients are called clinical research sites. Typically, they have been doctors' offices, but they can also be freestanding sites where that's all they do for a living and they still work with doctors, or academic hospitals that are also doing research. And then, of course, and last but not least, are the participants. Every drug or medical product you take, you stand on the shoulder of a participant who participated in a clinical trial and tried to help you figure out whether this product could work for you or not. And then in this new world, we have the use of technology and this new world, because we used to all do this in pen and paper, NCR paper, everything was, now we use computers clearly to collect the data, but it was still done centrally. And there's this new group of clinical trials, and it's really not a new group, but a new way of doing clinical trials using technology, much like you use your phone for a boarding pass now. Instead of printing it, you can use your phones and Apple Watches or what have you to collect data for a clinical trial. And that gets us to a decentralized clinical trial, which is a trial where some or all of the clinical trial activities happen at a place other than the central research site.
Fantastic. Well, it's a great overview. So some of the organizations, obviously, most people know the big life science companies, the Pfizers,
right,
the Bayers, the Mercks, et cetera, who have these R&D departments. They typically don't run the trials, right? They typically almost pass them off to the CRO.
They outsource them.
Right.
They outsource them to the CRO to run them, and then the clinical sites still, yeah.
So you used to work at Duke, right? Which is a major as part of the clinical site there, Duke University in North Carolina. So can you explain a bit of the relationship between the CRO and the centers, and who's doing what, particularly around the sort of issues which is patient recruitment and then patient management, because I know they're both big problems.
Yes. So at Duke, Duke is a big hospital, but they also have what's called a Duke Clinical Research Institute, which is an academic research organization instead of a clinical research organization. And what they do is they can do everything to set up a trial or parts of the things to set up a trial. So a pharma company can say, Duke, I'd like you to run this trial for me. Here's the drug I want you to study. And then they work with the local doctors at the DCRI, and CROs have the same setup. They have medical directors, and they write the protocol. So they write the recipes. And then they also, the other part a CRO does is they go find the clinical research sites where the trial can be conducted. And then those sites help find a patient. So a CRO would be sometimes writing the protocol, finding the sites, managing the sites, and going to the site to make sure that the data is collected correctly. And then at the end of it, they would collect the data, do the data cleaning of the database, and potentially create a clinical study report, the CSR, which would go to the FDA to show, hey, this works, but here are the side effects. But all in all, the risk profile is fine for what you're trying to do with this drug, and it should get approved.
So my understanding is that the problem that companies like Medable are trying to solve is that it's been tough to get people into the trials. I mean, recruiting is a big problem. And it's also been very tough to get people to get participants to stay in the trial or to manage them while they're in there. So tell me a bit about Medable's evolution, which I think originally started out way back when Michelle Olmeyer was doing it as a sort of company which was allowing people to researchers to build their own technology stack to build their own trials. But it's evolved quite a bit in recent years, raised a lot of money. Tell me a bit about what Medable's the problem that Medable's solving and how Medable's solving it.
So there are a few problems that people talk about when they're clinical research coming together. It's finding the right patients, the right participants. It's finding the right sites, and it's keeping people in the trial in the way that you say, and doing all that in a timely manner. Because maybe you can find all the participants over 10 years, but if you can get your drug approved in 2 years, that's obviously a very different value proposition for the pharma company. So
and to be completely blunt, the reason is because you can start selling the drug, and the patent goes from the time the drug's discovered, not the time the drug's approved. So the quicker you get it approved,
yes. So it's a patent issue. It's a race against time in many ways, right? And honestly, it's not just a value issue. It's also value for the participants, because if you have a disease that needs a drug, you don't want to wait 10 years if you can get it in 2 if the trial can be done faster. So it's not just only the pharma company that benefits. In many ways, we're also doing this because the the patients need these drugs, especially in diseases where there aren't any drugs. So what Medable does is this issue of finding patients. I used to run a site for 12 years in Sarasota. And we did many trials, and what we found is that we were able to enroll the patients that could, so to speak, the people that could take time off from their work to come to the research site, get consented, fill out questionnaires, get procedures done, all those kind of things. And that limits the people that can participate, because not everybody could take time off from work. And frankly, in Florida, many times it was pensioners, people that were retired, right? That's who lives in Florida most of the time. And so for them, it was nice. But what we didn't find is other people that did not have that time. And, we've all had jobs. I worked as a cashier for many years in Belgium because my dad worked in supermarkets. And it wasn't like I could tell them there, hold on a second, I need to go to my clinical trial site for 2 hours, but I'll be back. That didn't work. So what we're trying to do with Medable is use technology to make it simpler to participate. So wouldn't it be easy that instead of driving 2 hours to a research site to do a consent, you can do a consent much in the way that we're doing this interview right now over a video call, a Zoom call, or a televisit is what we call it. And you would still talk to the person running the trial, but you would do it in video. You would get the consent ahead of time. You could read it. You could ask questions much in the same way as you would by being physically there. And then you could also sign it online and be authenticated. So that saves time. And maybe if it turns out the trial isn't right for you, you haven't wasted 2 hours of your day to drive to the site. Same for then collecting the data. Instead of coming to the site, wouldn't it be great if you can use your phone to sort of fill out the questionnaires that you normally would have gotten in paper, or to use, I just lost my Apple Watch in the river, but use your Apple Watch to, collect the 6-minute walk test is a very common test for mobility activity in a clinical trial. Literally in a doctor's office, there would be either tape on the floor or cones or something. Walk for 6 minutes and they count how far you went, and that's a 6-minute walk test. Well, if you have a disease that has diurnal variation, so some days you feel good, some days you don't feel good, you come in once a month, who's to say whether that was a good day or a bad day, and you're really capturing the difference a drug may or may not make. Wouldn't it be better to count all the days you're walking about in your house and kind of use that as a trend, so the data collection can be better? We could better assess adverse events earlier in between the visits. And then all those things make it much easier for participants to participate. And if something is easy, you stick with it, right? So that is the whole point. Using technology in the same way you use it in other places in your life to make it easier to participate. And it might even be that you get better data for it. Like I said, instead of once a month collection of 1 point, you get it over time continuously. And so with that, we think that we know that trials can end earlier. And if they end earlier, like I said, and it's better to fail earlier too. Sometimes you need to know, like you need to stop spending money on a drug that doesn't work, and knowing that earlier is good too. But you could also know earlier when it works, and then it could get to the market faster.
So what does Medable, so I get recruited into a clinical trial, what does Medable provide me as a patient or a clinical trial participant with? I mean, do you send me a watch? Are you responsible for the delivery of the drugs, or I'm taking a drug? What are you doing, and then how are you how is that participant being interacted with by the Medable team?
So what we do is we basically have a technology platform up on which all these things live. I would say plug and play probably ages me, but like you would have, and it would be in combination with a sponsor of a clinical trial who would say, here's a trial we want to do. We would look at it and go like, okay, well, we want you to do e-consent, so consent online. We want you to use questionnaires on your phone, and we want you to use this watch to collect, blood pressure measurement at home. So what Medable then would do is work with the customer, and then we would we would set up the technology so a site could invite a patient for the visit. We would also set up a system where people could answer questionnaires on their phone. And there's 2 ways of doing that. You could use a provision device, which means everybody gets the same phone sent to you. And if that's the case, then Medable would send the phones to the participant. They would be research phones for them to use to collect the data. Many cases, it's actually better to use your own device, especially, for example, in Parkinson's. People are used to their phones. They know how they work. Like if you were to send me a Samsung phone, it would be really, or a different phone. I just am used to the phone I have. And if you send me a different system, it would be hard. And that may then mean that you collect the data in a way that's not that great. So you then do BYOD, which is bring your own device, use your own device, or you provision phones. If there are sensors to be used to collect physiological data, whether that's your weight, whether that's a blood pressure, we would send those sensors along as well. And then on the app, people would be invited to a Medable app where they would answer the questionnaires, where there might be resources that tell them about their trial, where there would be a copy of their consent form always available for them. And it would sort of be an app, much like you use any other app. It would just be for the research study.
All right. So then I want a little bit of the relationship before we dive into the FDA recommendations and the science we do. Just for the last questions on the businesses. I know there are obviously other people doing flavors of this. Some of the folks at Evidation have got a big panel of people who they send devices to and working. And there are obviously many competitors in the remote clinical trial space. But I mean, it sounds to me as though this is a fairly obvious extension of what a CRO was doing anyway. So the obvious, and I know one of the big investors in and partners in Medable is PPD, which is a big CRO. So kind of the dumb question is, why do we need a specialist remote clinical trial company? And should Medable be becoming the CRO, or should CROs just be doing this anyway? Is this a separate business, or is it something that eventually it'll just be a CRO and that's how trials are run?
Well, I think the beauty of different economic spaces is that there's different options for different people, right? So it may be that some CROs create their own tech stack, and I think some are doing that. And then other CROs may opt to stick to their core business of finding the sites and managing the sites and monitoring the data, and want to have a technology partner to bring that specific.
So you're saying they kind of view Medable as another site, right? As another, it just happens to be that this one is, you're managing a diverse set of patients across their own.
Well, we'd manage their sites, but give
Okay.
the technology stack for their sites. And I think there might some be technology companies who are going to be doing it all and become the CRO. I think this is all still very, I mean, it's not very nascent, but it's not, if you think about all the trials that are being done on ct.gov, there's, I think, thousands, 30,000 a week that are being submitted or some crazy number. Like this is, there's still a place to grow. And I think time will tell what the best model is. But like with everything in life, for some people, they might want the whole thing together and others prefer to sort of pick and choose from different vendors. I think there's many ways this can go. And I think that's the beauty of it, because one size almost never fits all. And I think that's what the model will show. Yeah.
Fair enough. So let's dive in a little bit to the sort of state of play and the recommendations from the FDA. So you just mentioned there are a gazillion clinical trials announced on clinicaltrials.gov all the time. A lot of them spend a long time recruiting a few patients, and it's very problematic to get it going. And there was an incredible amount of interest, obviously, during the pandemic in decentralized and remote clinical trials, and that's when Medable started getting huge amounts of funding, and other companies got involved in this space as well. What's the state of play? How many, what rough share is your guess of clinical trial participants or clinical trials are being done remotely, or at least mainly remotely, or hybrid with a big chunk of remote? How far have we got? And then tell me a bit about the FDA's proposed guidelines.
Well, one of the things to remember, and some of the regulators have said this in meetings, is that some of the things we're not calling part of a DCT have been done for years, like, ECOAs. So these outcome assessments, clinical outcome assessments, the survey basically. A lot of sites, companies have been using ECOAs on a phone or some technological on a computer for years and years. Home health nurses. A lot of companies have been using home health nurses for years. Now we're going back to local labs, which is also a component of decentralization. Like, let's have people do things close to their homes, so it's easy for them, and we keep participants in the study. That was how we did trials 30 years ago. Then we went to the central labs, and now we're kind of going back to local labs. So some of these things are actually being rebranded in some ways as a DCT element. So I think there's a timeline that floats around the internet that, if you use the remote trial that Pfizer did, that was in 2007. So this has been going on for decades. The pickup has been slowish until COVID came around, because then clearly it became like, well, we have to do this because people can't come to the sites. Sites were closed, or some people in oncology clinical trials, you probably wouldn't want them coming to a place where there were a lot of people. Right. And so with that, we learned that this is what patients prefer. And if you go to a lot of meetings about DCTs and adoptions, patients, just last Monday, we were talking about something related to DCTs. They were like, I know some of this is really hard to implement and do, but please know patients want this. We are worth it. This is what you need to be doing. So I think the uptake is coming. We are not known to be a very risk sort of kind of field, nor should we be, maybe, because there's lives at hand. But I think people are working very hard through the issues that are coming up that are new to kind of make this work for everything, just like every other industry has in the past. I mean, most people don't think twice about putting their banking information online and doing banking online. But in the beginning, people were a little. So I think it's going to be an adoption.
Can you give me a guess at the sort of where we are on a percentage scale, or 1 to 10 of number of trials that are remote versus traditional at the moment?
It's really hard to guess, because we've actually looked at clinicaltrials.gov, and it's even hard to figure out what elements are done remotely or not, because we don't have a good nomenclature for sort of identifying what's being done. And even in the guidances, that actually it's the EMA recommendations paper, they are saying that sponsors should be better about displaying clearly which elements could be considered remote, so that people can take that into considerations. And we have a project coming up around ethical review of DCTs, doing that appropriately and not taking more time than a regular clinical trial. And what IRBs were telling us, ethics committees, is that, even they had a hard time figuring out what was done remotely for them to do an appropriate review. And sometimes they saw a sentence in a consent that said, you will doing this on video. And then they had to ask, like, what exactly are you doing? So I think people are getting better at writing all of this up, and then we'll be able to track this better.
So tell me about the FDA. Sorry, so tell me about the FDA guidelines that are being proposed. They're proposed, right? Not enforced at the moment. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're a draft at the moment, and there's a period that people can comment until like 3 months from the date, which I think was May 2nd. So we have till about September to comment. I mean, I think what is good about it is we were waiting for it because we were all working under the guidance during COVID about ongoing trials where they allowed a lot of these technologies to be used so that critical clinical trials could continue. Again, patients, participants need these trials to get to treatments, right? And so the good news is that now they've written the guidance, we've all been waiting on it, and there's some really good elements in it that they bring up and sort of to move this forward. And they kind of outline, things that people should think about, such as if you're using technology, say a watch to capture EKG or something like, or EKG device, make sure you can figure out, you plan for the safety signals that are going to come through. Are you going to monitor continuously? When you see something, what's going to happen? Is the site going to be notified? Is the patient going to be notified? So all those things you need, because it's a slightly different workflow of things that are happening, or communication between all these different actors that we now have. And it's a good thing we have non-traditional sites helping collect data, but it also created a little bit of like, how do we know they're doing it right? And how do we oversee that? And sort of creating a plan that the principal investigator at a site that now has these tentacles into the communities, which are great because we all want trials to get closer to the participants, but how do you do that correctly? So they highlight a few things like that. And they really indicated that, DCTs are just going to be, or technology, I guess, is just going to be part of how you do clinical trials. We just need you to think about it. We need you to make it fit for purpose, and you need to do it correctly. Like, I mean, this is not some shortcut for anything. So I think that is the gist that I would take from the guidance. Yeah.
So two last questions for you, Pam. First one is, you in your research about the impact of trials being done at Medable and elsewhere, what have you come up with? What insights do you have that may be a little bit unexpected about how these are working, the impact of them, the efficacy, etc., of a decentralized clinical trial? What can you tell me?
So the data we found was in the context of trying to figure out whether it's worth investing in decentralized trials. Because as you can imagine, using pen and paper is still cheaper than using a technology and a platform and phones and all that kind of stuff. And we wanted to sort of understand, is this worth it? And one of the methodologies you do that in the pharma world is expected net present value. Like, is your investment now worth the value you're going to get from it discounted over time by the time that the value is created? And we work with Ken Getz and the Center and Tufts Center for Drug Development. And what we found is that, yes, it was worth it. So financially, if you make an investment, you will recoup that 5 times out of your phase 2 trials and 13 times out of your phase 3 trials. What that was based on is protocol performance parameters that are the first indications of how a DCT changed the way a clinical trial performs if you use DCT elements. What we found is that by using decentralized elements, a trial would finish 1 to 3 months earlier than if you had not used it. And so that shows directly that there's an improvement of, the trial finishes early for the same reasons we discussed earlier. That's a good thing for the pharma company. It's a good thing for the patients as well. We also have less amendments. We have about 15% less amendments. An amendment is something, you have the recipe of the clinical trial, says what you're supposed to be doing. When we were a site, we would often call about the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Patients that just missed something on a lab value that were a little too high, a little too low, anything on that. And then over time, then the company would say, okay, there's so many people that fall in that category. We'll write a change to the recipe called an amendment. That needs to go back to the IRB. That sometimes requires a new consent form. So there's costs involved with having amendments. Every amendment is a couple $100,000. So if you can avoid them, that is great. That's money in the bank. And we found a 15% reduction. The other reduction we found was in screen failures, 15% reduction of screen failures. That's another good thing. The one thing we don't know is because of what data we had, it was limited. And we're going to do more work on this with Tufts, is why that happened. Like, what are the reasons for that? And that is the work we're continuing to do.
All right, so I would say you can bucket the whole thing, which sort of sounds promising, and you've got a lot of work to do. So for companies like Medable and CROs and others who are working in this space, the last question is, what do you think the future is to get from the promise and the sort of high values we saw when all that money was being raised to a reality of them being a bigger part of the clinical trials landscape?
Well, you're talking to the person who's looking at evidence about these things. So I think the way to get us from here to there is to show that this works. I think this is a trust but verify. We were in the trust phase during COVID. I think we're now in the verify phase. And so with Medable, Michelle's made an investment in wanting to understand how these things actually work by creating the science department. I think we're pretty unique with that in this space. And so my goal is that we can actually give numbers and tell people, this is why you should do this. This makes sense. Here's objective data. That's why we're working with other people such as Duke University and Harvard, so that the data has to be trusted. And when the data is trusted, people will feel more comfortable making a change, instead of, there's lives at hands here. Like, you don't want to do something that is wrong. And nobody wants to do that. But what we want to do is, when you do a DCT, let us collect metrics to make sure that we can show that we're actually on the right track and we can continue proving the benefit. I think once we prove the benefit, and this is also what regulators want to see, I think, is, show us that this actually works. We all know about the promise. Let's get to the phase of actual evidence. And once we have evidence, I think the sky will be the limit. We still need to be fit for purpose, because not everything will work in every trial for every patient population. But if you do this responsibly and collect evidence along the way, I think that would be great.
Yeah, it's very similar to to what happens to the mental health online boom that happened during COVID, where you start seeing now, after a couple of 2 or 3 years of this, a lot of craziness going on, but now you're starting to see some studies being promoted by the larger, more responsible companies saying, okay, does this stuff actually work, and can we prove it, and can we get some clinical evidence? And I think a lot of the work across all of digital health is through clinical evidence. Yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention that is also something we are testing out and is a big promise for DCT and use of technologies is, in clinical trials, we haven't been the best at including the patients, that the people in the trial that actually look like the people with the disease. So representation is really important. And one of the promises is also that by making it easier for people to participate, we can actually reflect the people that live with the disease, which then means that the drug is shown to prove in that population. And it gives people confidence that they can use it, because not everything works exactly the same in every patient group because of social determinants of health and all those kind of things. So I think that is that's another promise, and that's another one we're committed to finding evidence to.
Is Medable itself responsible for the sort of recruiting? And I know that Walgreens and others.
Not always. It depends on what we have. But having the technology in and of itself, we think, will enable a better recruitment format. Yeah,
sounds reasonable. All right. Well, I've been talking with Pam Tenaerts. She is the Chief Scientific Officer of Medable, which is one of the giants of the clinical, the giants in the pygmy, the giant among the pygmies, I guess, of the clinical trial recruiting, remote clinical trial space. Pam, thanks for your time. Really interesting catching up on how Medable's doing and the scientific work you're doing about it, and look forward to seeing more as this develops. Take care now.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah.